The first thing Amara noticed was that no one would meet her eyes. Not the event planner balancing a silver clipboard against her chest, not the violinist near the marble staircase, not the two servers who had spent the last hour calling her ma'am in soft, respectful voices. Even the women by the champagne tower, women who had borrowed her recipes and copied her charity speeches and complimented her restraint as if it were a fashion choice, had suddenly discovered an urgent interest in their glasses. The ballroom glowed gold and cream beneath cut crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of candles floated in mirrored bowls. The air smelled faintly of white roses, citrus polish, and cold silk. It was the Mercer Foundation Winter Gala, the kind of evening Amara had built with her own quiet hands year after year. She had chosen the string quartet. She had chosen the floral palette. She had rewritten Julian's opening speech that afternoon after he'd once again confused generosity with publicity. She had chosen, as always, to make everything beautiful for a man who no longer bothered to hide his contempt. "Actually," Julian said, adjusting the cuff of his tuxedo as if the evening were a minor inconvenience, "Vanessa will be doing the welcome." He didn't say it loudly. He didn't need to. The sentence slid through the room like a blade under a door. Amara stood at the foot of the staircase in a midnight blue gown she had steamed herself because the housekeeper's son had a fever and she had sent her home early. One hand rested lightly against the banister. Her posture remained perfect. Only the small tightening in her fingers betrayed the impact. Across from her, Vanessa Cole smiled with lips the colour of pressed wine. She was younger, polished in the obvious way some women learned when they believed expensive things could pass for depth. She wore a pale dress Amara had rejected that morning for being too eager, too loud, too hungry for attention. Julian had noticed. Of course he had. The planner cleared her throat. "Mrs. Mercer, I was told there had been a change?" Amara let the silence breathe for one long second. "A change," she repeated. Julian finally looked at her, not with shame, but with the calm impatience of a man rearranging furniture. "Vanessa's better for this crowd. More current. We need energy tonight." More current. As if Amara were a faded portrait, still hanging because no one had yet fetched a ladder. A few feet away, someone laughed too brightly. Glass kissed glass. The string quartet continued playing something soft and European and unbearably polite. The room moved around her as though humiliation, if delivered in a low enough tone, did not count as public cruelty. Vanessa stepped closer, almost tender in her performance. "I'm sure you'll be relieved," she said. "You've seemed tired lately." It was the cruelty of small words that stung most. Not a slap, not even an insult, just the intimate theft of position. The kind of dismissal women were expected to absorb without altering the room. Amara felt the temperature of the marble beneath her heels, felt the cool draft brushing the back of her neck where her hair had been pinned up, felt the hot, humiliating pulse beating once in her throat. Still, she did not flinch. Because rage, once given to people like this, only fed them. Julian turned to the planner. "Move Amara's place card from the head table. Put her near the donor wives." Not beside him. Not where she had sat for 11 years. Near the donor wives, as if she were ornamental. As if this foundation had not begun on her dining room table with a legal pad, a chipped porcelain mug, and 2 years of her unpaid labor. As if the names on those donor cards did not answer her calls because she, not Julian, remembered their dead mothers, their favorite charities, their private griefs. No one spoke. That was the worst part. Not the insult. The agreement. Amara looked at Vanessa then, truly looked at her. and saw the delicate triumph vibrating just beneath her smile. A woman being fitted into another woman's life and mistaking the vacancy for victory. Then she looked at Julian. His expression was already elsewhere, on the room, on his image, on the version of the evening in which his wife stepped aside gracefully and his mistress took center stage without mess. He thought her silence meant surrender. He had spent years mistaking stillness for weakness. Amara inclined her head, the movement so controlled it was almost regal. "Of course," she said. Julian relaxed. Vanessa smiled wider. The planner exhaled in gratitude, relieved the difficult thing had remained elegant. Amara turned and walked away before any of them could see the bloodless ache in her face. Her heels made almost no sound on the corridor runner. Only when she reached the shadowed antechamber outside the ballroom did she let herself stop. The walls there were paneled in walnut. The music came muffled through the doors, distant and distorted, as if the night itself had stepped behind glass. Her phone vibrated inside her clutch. Unknown number. International. She almost ignored it. Then a voicemail appeared before the vibration had fully ended. Amara stared at the screen. Halberg and Pike Succession Chambers. Urgent. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breathing. Slow, controlled, measured into obedience. Behind the ballroom doors, the applause began. Vanessa, no doubt, had taken the stage. Amara pressed play, and the voice on the message said very clearly, "Ms. Amara Vale, please contact us immediately. This concerns the activation of a private inheritance estate currently valued at $29 billion. She did not move. But something inside her, quiet and ancient and long denied, finally opened its eyes. Amara had spent most of her adult life learning how to disappear without ever actually leaving the room. She was 39, tall, dark-eyed, composed in the way some women became after surviving too many disappointments in public. She had not been born into silk or old houses or charity galas. She had been born in South London, to a mother who taught piano in borrowed church halls and wore the same wool coat for 8 winters because dignity, in their home, was measured less by possession than by presentation. There had never been enough money, but there had always been standards. Shoes polished, backs straight, tears handled privately. Her mother used to say, "The world watches women most carefully when it believes they have nothing. So let it see grace and wonder what else it missed." Amara had carried that lesson into every room of her life. She met Julian Mercer 12 years earlier when he was still a sharp man in expensive shoes trying to become a legend. He had ambition with edges, charm polished to a bright, almost dangerous shine. He saw possibilities everywhere, in properties, in people, in names that could be used as stepping stones. At the time, Amara mistook his intensity for vision. He mistook her steadiness for endless supply. Back then, she worked in heritage restoration, consulting quietly on historic interiors and overlooked estates, the kind of work that required taste, patience, and the ability to see value where louder people saw only dust. Julian loved telling people later that he rescued her from obscurity. The truth was far less flattering to him. She had rescued him from looking unfinished. It was Amara who softened his sharp public image. Amara who redesigned his first investor dinners so the rooms felt intimate instead of predatory. Amara who wrote the personal notes that turned donors into loyalists. Amara who sat beside his mother during those long final months of illness, when Julian was too overwhelmed to come home before midnight. His mother, Eleanor Mercer, had known exactly what her son was. Not evil, that would have been simpler, just entitled, in the slow, corrosive way wealth and unchecked admiration often made men. Before she died, Eleanor took Amara's hand in the dim light of the hospice room and whispered, "He confuses devotion with ownership. Don't let him do that to your soul." Amara never forgot it. Still, she stayed. For a while, staying seemed noble, then practical, then habit. The Mercers moved through a world of private clubs, old money whispers, strategic philanthropy, and carefully edited marriages. In that world, women like Amara were prized for poise as long as that poise remained useful. She was the elegant wife who made Julian appear civilized. The woman who remembered names, birthdays, scholarship recipients, dietary restrictions, and grief anniversaries. The one who never drank too much, never dressed too desperately, never fought in public. People called her gracious. What they meant was manageable. Vanessa arrived 2 years earlier as the new brand partnerships director. Brilliant with numbers, quick with social media language, very skilled at performing admiration. She understood Julian almost immediately. Not the deeper machinery of him, perhaps, but the surface controls. Praise his instincts, mirror his ambition, laugh at his coldest jokes, and always look as though proximity to him were a privilege large enough to erase self-respect. At first, Amara dismissed her as another passing satellite. Then came the smaller shifts. Julian started taking work calls on the terrace. He started changing jackets before evening events. He began saying, "You wouldn't understand the pace now," whenever Amara questioned anything. Vanessa's perfume appeared once in the back seat of the car, then in the downstairs study, then, impossibly, on the cashmere throw in Julian's private lounge. Amara noticed everything. She simply never announced her noticing. Because public women were trained early, if you pointed too quickly, people called you insecure. If you waited too long, they called you blind. So she watched. She watched Julian become careless, watched staff members grow uncomfortable, watched board members offer her those pitying half-smiles reserved for wives who were the last to be officially informed, watched Vanessa begin using phrases Amara herself had once coined in strategy meetings, as though intelligence, like lipstick, could be borrowed. And through all of it, Amara remained still. Not because she lacked courage, because she had learned long ago that still water reflected more than splashing ever did. There was another reason, too, one Julian never understood. He believed Amara had nowhere else to go. He thought her quiet came from dependence. What he did not know was that she handled more of the invisible architecture of his world than he did. She knew which donors gave from guilt and which gave from fear. She knew which bank was extending Mercer Global a bridge line it could barely justify. She knew the foundation's public numbers were cleaner than the private ones. She knew his expansion into Singapore was not strength, but desperation dressed in glass and steel. Julian had spent so much time standing on stages that he forgot someone had to read the contracts in the wings. That someone was usually Amara. The voicemail remained unheard by anyone but her for exactly 19 minutes. By the time the gala ended, she had listened to it 4 times. $29 billion. The number did not feel real.
It sat too heavily in the mind, like a foreign object. She had no wealthy relatives, no secret dynasty, no reason for succession lawyers with clipped London vowels to be calling her at midnight during a public dismantling of her marriage. And yet they had used her maiden name, Amara Vale, a name Julian almost never spoke anymore. By the time the last guests drifted out beneath the winter-dark portico and the floral arrangements began to droop in the heated air, Amara understood two things with perfect clarity. First, her humiliation tonight had not been accidental. It had been rehearsal. And second, somewhere beyond the life Julian believed he controlled, a door had opened. The days that followed did not explode. They tightened. There was something almost insulting about how ordinary betrayal remained while it was actively rearranging your life. Coffee still brewed at 6:30. Delivery men still rang the side entrance. The gardener still clipped the dormant hedges into disciplined lines outside the Mercer townhouse, as though symmetry itself could protect a household from rot. Julian behaved as men often did when they believed they had already won, with greater boldness and less imagination. The morning after the gala, Vanessa's name appeared on the agenda for the Foundation's spring planning retreat in Amara's place. By noon, the staff had been instructed to direct branding approvals through Vanessa's office. By evening, an overnight bag with a gold clasp, unmistakably feminine and absolutely not Amara's, sat on the leather bench inside Julian's dressing room. No explanation was offered. That, too, was part of the insult. Explanations implied you still deserved the dignity of being addressed. Amara moved through the house with her usual calm. She thanked the cook. She reviewed scholarship letters. She corrected a date on the museum donor list.
But inwardly she was becoming precise in a new way. She began to separate sentiment from fact, grief from evidence, injury from leverage. Julian, meanwhile, wanted signatures. 3 days after the gala, he entered the breakfast room carrying a slim folder and the brittle confidence of a man whose moral discomfort had long ago calcified into irritation. "I need this today," he said, setting the folder near her untouched tea. Amara glanced at it. "What is it?" "Spousal consent on the restructuring package. Routine." Nothing in Julian's world was ever routine when it required legal paper at breakfast. She opened the folder. Pages slid beneath her fingers, expensive and sharp-edged. Cross-collateral language, temporary reassignment clauses, asset shielding, a bridge extension tied to reputational continuity and residential guarantees. Her eyes slowed. The family townhouse, though purchased after marriage, had been placed inside a protected domestic trust for tax efficiency. The Foundation's image rights and co-chair endorsement were referenced in appendices. Her presence, not merely her signature, but her continued public role as stabilizing spouse, was part of the bank's confidence structure. In simpler terms, Julian needed her image to continue underwriting his illusions. He poured coffee without asking whether she wanted any. "You can have Caroline review it if that makes you feel better." "Caroline is your corporate attorney." "And very competent." Amara closed the folder softly. "Then she can explain why a routine document requires my public participation to preserve investor comfort." Julian's jaw shifted once. Only once. "Don't dramatize this." That almost made her smile. He, a man sleeping with another woman in a house she had made habitable, accusing her of dramatics because she could read. "I'll have my own counsel review it," she said. His cup touched the saucer a little harder than necessary. "There is no need to turn this adversarial." No need.
as if adversity had not been placed at her seat, poured into her glass, and asked to make opening remarks in her husband's voice. He leaned back. "Amara, be sensible. The company is scaling. The world is different now. This isn't about feelings." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the faint exhaustion beneath his carefully maintained face. The late nights, the extra charm, the slight impatience that came when reality refused to align with his performance. Mercer Global was not scaling. It was straining. That afternoon, Halberg and Pike sent a car. The city outside the window looked metallic in the winter light, all steel reflections and breathless movement. Amara sat in silence as they drove downtown to a private office suite high above the river. There, two lawyers and a grey-haired woman with the posture of someone born around power explained what should have been impossible. Her mother, Lila Vale, had not been entirely who she claimed to be. Or rather, she had once been someone else, before choosing a quieter life. The Laurent family, owners of a sprawling, privately held global empire spread across infrastructure, shipping, renewable energy, finance, art, and old European land, had severed ties with Lila decades earlier, after she married beneath expectation and disappeared. Too proud to reconcile while she lived, the family patriarch had spent years trying to locate any surviving descendant after learning of her death. The search had taken time. Privacy laws, old sealed records, deliberate disappearances, grief layered over pride. And now, he was dead. With no surviving children and no grandchildren other than the daughter his daughter had once carried out of that world in her arms. Amara. The inheritance was not a simple bank balance. It was a control structure. Voting rights, core assets, family trusts, a majority position in Laurent Meridian Holdings, and the personal estate of Gabrielle Laurent, estimated conservatively at $29 billion. She listened without interruption. Only once did her throat tighten, when they placed her mother's photograph on the table. Younger than Amara had ever known her, standing on a sunlit terrace in the south of France, laughing, elegant in an understated cream dress, wearing on her finger a signet ring Amara had kept for years in a velvet box without understanding the crest engraved into the gold. Her mother had never told her, perhaps out of fear, perhaps protection, perhaps shame, perhaps survival. All her life, Amara had believed their scarcity was complete history. Now she learned it had been chosen exile. The grey-haired woman, the family office chair, folded her hands. There is one additional matter. Mercer Global is currently part of a financing review involving two institutions under Laurent Meridian's indirect control. Amara's gaze lifted. "How exposed are they?" she asked. The woman seemed almost faintly surprised by the question. "Materially." "Do they know?" "No." Amara sat back. There it was, the first cold edge of real perspective. Not revenge. Not yet. Just proportion. When she returned home that evening, the townhouse smelled of sandalwood candles Vanessa favored, and a dinner she had not planned. Laughter floated from the small salon. A woman's laughter. Bright, familiar, unashamed. Amara did not go in. Instead, she climbed the stairs, removed her earrings, and stood for a long moment in the dark of her dressing room, one hand resting against the velvet case that held her mother's old ring. Julian still thought he was choosing who would remain in his life. He did not yet understand that he was only choosing how much of it he would lose. The final insult arrived dressed as civility. Julian called it a necessary dinner. Only 6 guests, 2 board members, 1 private banker, Vanessa, a consultant from Singapore, And Amara, of course, because even erasure required her presence to look respectable. The dining room shimmered under low candlelight. Silver gleamed. Crystal breathed softly whenever someone lifted a glass. Outside, sleet feathered against the windows in thin white strikes. The room was warm, but Amara felt a coldness at the back of her neck that no fire could reach. Vanessa wore ivory. Not white. That would have been crude. Ivory, the shade of plausible deniability. She sat at Julian's right hand. No one commented on the placement. Course by course, the conversation proceeded as these things did. Tax environments, philanthropy optics, emerging markets, legacy positioning. Men speaking in polished abstractions, while women were expected to supply grace notes. Amara answered when addressed, smoothly, briefly, never enough to satisfy the room into thinking her comfortable. Then dessert was cleared. Julian set down his spoon and did something that years ago might have looked like resolve. "Before we close," he said, "there's a domestic adjustment I'd like everyone aligned on." The private bankers stilled. One board member looked immediately at his napkin. Vanessa did not lower her eyes this time. She had been waiting for the scene to become official. Julian turned toward Amara with the same expression he used when announcing renovations. "You've seemed overwhelmed lately, and with everything ahead, I think it's best if Vanessa begins stepping into some of your responsibilities." The room went perfectly, horribly quiet. Amara kept her hands folded in her lap. Julian continued, mistaking the absence of interruption for consent. "Publicly, socially, operationally. She'll take the Singapore trip. She'll oversee the spring calendar. And, for the time being, she'll be using the East dressing room and guest suite here when schedules run late." There it was. Not merely infidelity. Replacement. Spoken aloud and plated between porcelain and candlelight. Vanessa gave a small, sympathetic smile, as though she were accepting an award no one had asked for. "I want this to be graceful," Julian said. "No unpleasantness. We're adults." Graceful.
The word hit Amara harder than if he had shouted, because he was asking her to participate in her own removal, to make it easier, to keep the room comfortable while he slid another woman into the shape her life had once occupied. One of the board members cleared his throat, but said nothing. The consultant studied the condensation on her water glass. Even now, no one chose her. Julian pushed a second folder across the table. "I've had a transition agreement drafted," he said. "Temporary separation of domestic and foundation duties. We can formalize other matters later." Amara looked down at the folder. Cream paper. Heavy stock. Her name typed with immaculate cruelty. The housekeeper entered then with coffee service, perhaps unaware the room had become a grave. She froze almost imperceptibly when she saw the arrangement. Vanessa in ivory, Amara at the far side of the table, Julian performing benevolence. A spoon clinked once against china. That was the only sound. Amara lifted her gaze to Julian. His face held impatience now, sharpened by the fact that he had delivered the blow, and yet she remained unreadable. He needed reaction. Needed tears or pleading or anger, something to confirm his importance. He would not receive it. Instead, Amara stood. The movement was small, but every eye followed it. She did not touch the folder. She did not touch the wine. Her voice, when it came, was low enough that everyone had to lean toward it. "You should have waited," she said. Julian frowned. For what? For the truth, she thought. For the hour to turn. for the life beyond your imagination to arrive and make this room look as small as it is. But she did not offer him poetry, only clarity. For me to answer properly. Julian's expression hardened. Then answer now. Amara looked at Vanessa. Really looked. Not with hatred. Hatred required intimacy. What she felt instead was a kind of sorrow for women who entered other women's ruins and called it elevation. Then she looked back at her husband. No, she said softly. I'll answer where it matters. She walked out before anyone could stop her. Her heels clicked down the hallway, unhurried. The grandfather clock in the foyer marked the quarter hour with an old, solemn note. In the cloakroom, she reached for her coat and found her hand entirely steady. Only when she stepped into the winter air beneath the portico did she finally exhale. The cold struck her lungs clean. The driver moved toward her. She waved him back. For the first time in years, she wanted silence without witnesses. She took out her phone and returned the number from Halberg and Pike. They answered on the first ring. Ms. Vale-Laurent, the lawyer said.
The name stopped time. Not Mercer, not wife, not placeholder. A lineage she had never been allowed to know, now spoken into the freezing dark like a key turning in iron. We have completed verification, the voice continued. As of this afternoon, control has transferred. You are the sole beneficiary and principal authority of the Laurent estate. A car passed in the distance, tires hissing over wet pavement. Amara closed her eyes briefly. How much authority? She asked. A pause. Complete, the lawyer said. She opened her eyes. Through the lit windows of the dining room, she could see Julian's outline at the far end of the table, already irritated, already likely explaining her composure as instability. That was the last moment he ever looked powerful to her. Good, Amara said into the phone. And in the quiet that followed, she made her final decision. Power did not announce itself the next morning. It arrived in well-cut charcoal suits, encrypted documents, and women who did not waste words. For the next 6 days, Amara said almost nothing to Julian that was not practical. Yes, the florist should cancel Thursday's luncheon. No, she would not be attending Singapore. Yes, he could use the East Drive for his car. No, she had not yet signed the consent documents. If he mistook her restraint for paralysis, it was because arrogance often preferred simple stories. Meanwhile, another world unfolded behind closed doors. The Laurent family office had secured her private suite at the Halcyon, a discreet residence hotel overlooking the river where old wealth liked to become invisible. Her new legal team included a forensic accountant, a trusts attorney, a reputation strategist, and a former judge whose voice was so gentle it made men underestimate him seconds before he dismantled them. Amara reviewed everything. Not greedily, meticulously. Share structures, voting rights, legacy obligations, philanthropic commitments, shipping corridors, renewable holdings, art foundations, debt maps, subsidiaries nested within subsidiaries like lacquered boxes. At night, she read letters left by Gabrielle Laurent. Not absolving letters, not sentimental ones, but complicated documents written by a man old enough to understand that regret could not resurrect time. In one, he wrote, "Your mother left because she would not raise a daughter in a house where love was negotiated like trade. If you are reading this, then I failed twice. First as a father, then as a coward. Everything you inherit is yours to use better than I did." Amara read that line 3 times. Then she placed the letter back in its folder and returned to the Mercer files. Because while old grief had found her, present danger remained practical. Mercer Global was weaker than even she had assumed. Julian's expansion pitch depended on a rescue package led, through layered vehicles and private commitments, by Laurent Meridian Capital. Without that package, his leverage ratios would trigger covenant pressure within weeks. Without his social image, the stable marriage, the polished foundation, the old house respectability Amara had supplied, the board would begin asking the questions he had spent years outrunning. And then there was the foundation. The foundation Amara had built in earnest while Julian used it as lacquer. The forensic team found internal transfers routed near legal limits, vanity expenditures buried inside donor events, and planned reassignments that would have effectively stripped Amara of operational authority while preserving her name for appearances. She listened to the findings in silence. Then she gave instructions. Protect the scholarship endowment. Freeze any reputation-based licensing using her speeches, letters, or likeness. Prepare divorce filing under seal until timing required otherwise. Acquire Mercer Global's senior debt position the moment pricing allowed. Review occupancy status of the townhouse. Secure staff continuity and severance for any household employees displaced by the transition. There was no drama in any of it, only architecture. The truest revenge, Amara was learning, was not spectacle. It was consequence, correctly timed. On the 7th day, Julian invited her to the Mercer Global Investor Outlook, a polished private event at the Astral Tower, where he intended to announce international expansion, strategic leadership evolution, and the closing of a major financing commitment. He delivered the invitation in person, standing in the threshold of what had once been their shared sitting room, hands in his pockets, tie loosened. "You should attend," he said. "For optics, if nothing else." Amara looked up from the folder in her lap. "For optics." His mouth tightened. "Let's not be childish." He still thought the worst thing a woman could be was inconvenient. Vanessa hovered a few feet behind him, holding a tablet, dressed in soft beige, as though neutrality could cleanse ambition. She did not come fully into the room. Replaceable women often confused proximity with permission. Julian continued. "The board needs continuity until everything is finalized." Everything. As if lives were subscriptions to be updated. Amara closed the folder. "I'll be there." Something flickered across his face. Relief, perhaps, tinged with triumph. He heard compliance because he could not imagine design.
On the morning of the event, the city woke under a pale sheet of cloud. The sort of light that made glass buildings look both pure and merciless. Amara dressed slowly, not for revenge, not even for war, for recognition. She chose a cream silk blouse with a high collar, a sharply tailored black suit, and her mother's signet ring. No diamonds, no performance. Her hair was gathered low at the nape, her makeup nearly invisible, her expression calm enough to make weaker people uneasy. At noon, while Julian rehearsed his future into microphones upstairs, Laurent Meridian finalized the acquisition of Mercer Global's senior secured debt through a legal instrument so precise it left almost no room for theatrical denial. At 12:15, the board received updated briefing packets. At 12:20, the Foundation Council served notice of Amara's immediate withdrawal of name and likeness rights from all Mercer charitable branding pending investigation. At 12:30, Vanessa was denied access to the executive salon because her temporary badge had been deactivated. That was the first moment she understood something was wrong. By 1 o'clock, the room was full. Investors, bankers, culture editors, strategic partners, board members wearing their concern in expensive neutrals.
Julian stood beneath the stage lights in a midnight suit, polished and handsome in the way morally hollow men often were when they were still being believed. Vanessa had recovered enough to stand near the side aisle, smiling too brightly. Amara entered through the rear doors just as the moderator stepped to the podium. A low murmur passed through the room. She felt it move over her like weather. Not because she was Julian's wife, because half the room had already read the addendum in their packets. The moderator adjusted his papers, visibly unsettled. "Before Mr. Mercer begins," he said, "there has been a governance update affecting today's financing announcement. Representing Laurent Meridian Holdings and the Laurent family estate, Ms. Amara Vale Laurent." Silence. Not polite silence. Shock silence. The kind that emptied the air of oxygen. Julian turned. For one brief, exquisite second, his face lost all arrangement. Vanessa's expression cracked outright. Amara walked down the center aisle with measured steps, the softest sound in the room, and somehow the one no one could escape. Heads turned, chairs creaked. Somewhere, a camera lowered instead of lifting, the instinctive gesture of someone realizing they were no longer observing gossip, but power. She reached the stage and accepted the additional microphone. Julian stared at her. "What is this?" Her eyes did not leave his. "Accuracy." The word landed like stone in water. She turned to the room. "Thank you all for your patience. There has been a change in controlling interests material to today's discussion." No tremor, no rush, only clarity. "As of last week, I became principal beneficiary and executive authority of the Laurent estate and its holdings, including Laurent Meridian Capital." A few people inhaled sharply. Someone in the second row whispered, "My God." Amara continued. "This morning, Laurent Meridian exercised its rights to acquire Mercer Global's senior secured position after reviewing material discrepancies in governance, exposure, and reputational disclosure." Julian found his voice. "You cannot do this here." She glanced at him then, almost kindly. "You asked me to answer where it matters." The line moved through the room with visible force. Amara shifted one page on the lectern. "Effective immediately, the proposed financing facility is withdrawn. Covenant review has begun. Independent inquiry into certain foundation-adjacent expenditures will follow. Relevant parties have been notified." Vanessa took one frantic step forward. "This is outrageous!" A security officer appeared at her side almost instantly. Not rough, not loud, just final. Her badge no longer worked. Her name was no longer on the access list. In rooms like these, that was a social death more violent than shouting. Amara did not look at her. Instead, she addressed the board. "Household staff previously employed through Mercer Domestic Accounts will be retained through an interim transition fund under my office pending reassignment or severance. Scholarship obligations will be protected. Donor communications have been prepared for anyone who prefers facts before speculation." One of the older board members lowered his eyes. He had known too. Perhaps not everything. Enough. Julian stepped closer, voice stripped now of polish. "Amara." She turned to him fully for the first time. He had never looked smaller. Not because his height had changed, because the fiction around him had. "You used my work," she said quietly, only for the microphone and the room. "My name, my restraint, my labor. You mistook my silence for dependence, and my dignity for permission." He swallowed. No one moved. "No more."
That was all. No screaming, no humiliation for sport, no frenzy. Only the clean removal of borrowed power. Then, with one final glance across the room that had so often watched women endure and call it grace, Amara stepped back from the podium. And every person there understood the same thing at once. She had not risen because she inherited billions. She had risen because the room had finally met the scale of the woman it had underestimated. By evening, the headlines had already begun their hungry work. Some called it a corporate reversal, others a succession shock. A few, more accurate than the rest, called it a public unmasking. Julian resigned within 10 days. Not nobly, not strategically, under pressure. The board announced an internal review. The private banker denied prior knowledge. Vanessa disappeared from every official photograph and, later, from the city's visible social orbit altogether. People like her were rarely punished by law. They were punished by doors that stopped opening. The townhouse was quieter than Amara had ever heard it. When she returned one last time to collect her mother's sheet music, the winter light lay pale across the floors she had chosen, the curtains she had hemmed, the rooms she had taught to feel human. The staff greeted her with an emotion so carefully restrained it nearly undid her. She made sure each of them had options: letters, placement assistance, severance where needed. Not because generosity made her superior, but because decency was easiest to prove when you finally had the power to stop performing it for approval. In the weeks that followed, Amara did not rush to become visible. That surprised people. They expected yachts, covers, declarations, transformed wardrobes, revenge interviews, dazzling entrances. They expected wealth to make noise. Instead, she made appointments. She sat with foundation auditors. She reopened scholarship programs Julian had starved quietly. She visited one of the Laurent archives in Marseille and stood for a long time before a wall of family portraits, seeing in their faces both resemblance and warning. She moved into a residence that overlooked water and sky and had no memories in its walls except the ones she chose to place there. And sometimes, in the early evening, when the city below her turned amber and blue, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and thought not about the billions, but about that night in the dining room. The folder on the polished table, the word graceful in Julian's mouth, the way everyone had looked away. That, she realized, had been the true inheritance she needed to reject. The old instruction given to so many women: endure elegantly, and perhaps one day someone will feel ashamed. But shame was unreliable. Truth was better. Consequence was better. Self-recognition was best of all. Julian requested a private meeting once. Only once. Her office declined. Not cruelly, simply without invitation. There would be no final conversation in a dim restaurant. No confession scene. No late apology trying to convert her survival into his character development. Some endings did not require witness from the people who caused them. They required distance. Spring came slowly. The first warm wind moved through the city, as if testing whether it was welcome. Trees softened. Pavements dried. Light lingered longer in the evenings. And in that gentler season, Amara stood on the terrace of the Laurent residence, one hand resting lightly on the cool stone rail, and understood with perfect calm that peace did not always arrive looking like joy. Sometimes it arrived as the absence of dread. Sometimes it arrived
as a room in which no one could replace you, because you no longer lived by invitation. Sometimes it arrived as your own name, spoken fully. Amara Vale Laurent. A woman who had once been moved from the head table, a woman who now built her own. She did not smile often, not the bright, practiced smile expected by cameras and polished men. But that evening, as the air carried the scent of rain and distant jasmine from the courtyard below, something softer touched her face. Not triumph. Something better. Relief with dignity. And far beneath the noise of wealth, scandal, titles, and consequence, there remained the simplest truth of all. She had never been too quiet. They had simply been too shallow to hear her.